days earlier with a wagon train heading toward Missouri, despite the raging winter conditions. The cabin itself was eerily silent, though Ezekiel insisted the women had left recently. The rooms were too neat, too undisturbed. There were no signs of packing, no missing clothing or supplies, and the beds appeared to have gone untouched for days. Bishop Curtis and his men noted the absence of personal items, no journals, no sewing work, not even a single cooking pot out of place. More troubling still was what they found in the cellar. While inspecting the property, one of the men noticed a strong odor coming from beneath the floorboards. With Ezekiel distracted, they pried open a section of the wood and discovered something that froze them. More than the cold ever could, traces of blood soaked deep into the earth below. Ezekiel's demeanor shifted instantly. He became erratic, shouting about divine tests, accusing the bishop of doubting God's will. The group left the cabin with heavy unease, unsure of what they'd just uncovered, but certain that something terrible had happened. Despite their suspicions, there was no proof, no bodies, and no official action was taken. Ezekiel Whitmore remained in the settlement, attending services and continuing his trade, though he was no longer trusted. His reputation quietly dissolved, and he became a reclusive figure, avoided even by those who once called him brother. The truth might have stayed buried forever until 1920, when a construction crew working on a new meeting house uncovered human remains beneath the old chapel's foundation. 4 sets of bones, each missing the hands, were found wrapped in linen shrouds and buried in a shallow grave directly beneath where the pulpit once stood. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The church quietly launched an internal investigation and traced the remains back to the original land records. The chapel had been built in 1858 on land deeded by none other than Ezekiel Whitmore. Forensic examination, though limited by the tools of the time, confirmed the remains belonged to 4 women between the ages of 18 and 35. The cuts on their bones suggested deliberate violence, and faint chemical traces on the shrouds hinted at a rudimentary preservation process, possibly intended to delay decomposition. The church decided to classify the findings, locking away the records in a restricted archive. But rumors began to spread, stories of a man who spoke of revelations, but hid a darker truth, of wives who vanished in the snow without a trace, and of a chapel built not just on faith, but on a secret grave. Today, the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his wives remains one of the most chilling and unresolved mysteries in early Mormon history. Some believe he suffered a mental breakdown under the pressures of isolation and faith. Others think he may have been influenced by something even more sinister and unchecked authority over those completely dependent on him. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear: 4 women disappeared during one of Utah's harshest winters, and their silence was only broken decades later by the accidental swing of a shovel. Do you think Ezekiel acted alone, or could there have been others involved in covering up what happened at Mill Creek? Share your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this fascinate you, where faith, fear, and the frontier collide, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And join us next time as we uncover more forgotten truths hiding just beneath the surface of American history. Days earlier, the women had left with a group of trappers who promised to escort them safely back to civilization. At least, that was Ezekiel's story. When the bishop asked to see their belongings, Ezekiel led them through several rooms that looked recently emptied. Clothing, books, and personal items were gone, but heavier things like furniture and kitchen tools remained odd for women, supposedly making a permanent move. Even more concerning were signs of digging behind the cabin. Ezekiel claimed he was expanding the root cellar in preparation for winter, but the ground was frozen solid, and the disturbed earth was far more than what a typical storage area would require. When someone pointed out how hard it would be to dig in such conditions, Ezekiel responded sharply, saying that doing God's work required perseverance, no matter how difficult. The group spent the night at the cabin, and several later said the atmosphere felt deeply unsettling. The home was too quiet. There were none of the usual background signs of women, no soft voices, no movement of skirts, no small domestic touches. Dinner was made entirely of preserved foods, There was no fresh bread, no dairy. Strange, considering that such things would normally be made if the women had only recently left. But the most disturbing moment came during the night. One of the visitors, Thomas Garrett, woke to what he swore was the sound of quiet weeping coming from beneath the floorboards. The others dismissed it as wind or old wood creaking, but Garrett insisted he had heard someone in pain. The next morning, the bishop's group left with more questions than answers. In his private journal, Bishop Curtis wrote, "I fear Brother Whitmore has done something that will bring shame upon our people and our faith. The loneliness of winter drives men to dark places, and perhaps the burden of plural marriage proved too heavy for him." But the bishop faced a tough choice. The Mormon community was already under close watch by the federal government. Any scandal, especially one involving plural marriage, could spark outside interference. After discussing the matter with other church leaders, Curtis chose to observe quietly, hoping the truth would surface by spring. Over the winter, Ezekiel continued visiting the settlement alone, looking thinner each time. He claimed he was in contact with his wives, receiving letters confirming they were safe and content in the East. But he never showed these letters, saying they were too private or had been lost in a fire. People began to whisper. Some believed he really had sent the women away, maybe because he couldn't care for them, or the tension in the household had become unbearable. Others suspected something much darker. When spring arrived in April 1848, Bishop Curtis finally returned to the property for a full inspection. What he found would haunt him forever. The cabin appeared to have been abandoned for weeks. Dust coated the furniture. The rooms once belonging to the wives looked hastily cleaned, not lived in. Then the bishop found something that directly contradicted Ezekiel's story. Rebecca's private journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the final entry dated December 20th, 1847, was shaky and ominous. He says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the eternal family. But I fear his visions are not from heaven. Out back, the area Ezekiel had said was a root cellar project looked more like a burial site. The disturbed soil spanned a wide area and had clearly been worked on in stages. Then came the most chilling discovery: fragments of fabric matching the wives' clothes, personal items like Sarah's wedding ring, and traces of ritual activity. In a clearing nearby were signs of fires arranged in a pattern that felt ceremonial. Mixed with the ashes were burned scraps of religious writings, none from standard Mormon texts. Some surviving fragments referenced blood atonement and eternal sealing through sacrifice. Twisted interpretations of Mormon beliefs that shocked the bishop. Inside the cabin, in the bedroom shared by Ezekiel and Sarah, the bishop uncovered a hidden stash of notebooks. They were filled with Ezekiel's increasingly obsessive writings about a doctrine he called ultimate consecration, the idea that to reach the highest level of glory, one must give up everything, even life itself. The entries revealed his belief that his family had been chosen for a divine mission, requiring unimaginable sacrifice. As the journal continued, Ezekiel's handwriting grew more erratic, filled with disturbing ideas about the purifying power of innocent blood and the sealing of the eternal family through death. The evidence pointed to a horrifying conclusion: Ezekiel had likely killed his wives as part of a deranged religious ritual, but he had vanished completely. Despite the church's efforts, he was never found, likely lost somewhere in the vast western wilderness. Faced with a scandal that could destroy their community, church leaders chose secrecy. Revealing the truth could provoke federal action and increase anti-Mormon hostility. The records were sealed, and those who knew the truth were sworn to silence. The cabin was dismantled, and the land was officially marked as unfit for settlement. The women were listed as having voluntarily relocated to the east. But small towns remember. Rumors spread. Some said Ezekiel went mad from isolation. Others believed he discovered something in that remote valley, something ancient and terrible. Some even claimed the wives had been willing participants in the ritual, persuaded by Ezekiel's warped sense of divine purpose. That version was the most unsettling, suggesting not madness, but shared delusion. Over time, the land gained a reputation. Travelers reported feeling watched near the old site, and others said they heard women's voices on the wind during winter. Church leaders dismissed these claims, but the sense of something unresolved lingered. the truth may have stayed buried forever, if not for what happened in 1920. As the church grew, it needed new buildings. Leaders chose a site in the Mill Creek area, flat, central, and as far as they knew, unremarkable. On a crisp October morning, construction began. The project leader, Brother Samuel Morrison, had grown up hearing whispers about the old Whitmore property, but had always considered them folklore. Work went smoothly at first. By the third day, everything changed. For feet below the surface, the crew uncovered a square stone chamber, clearly man-made, carefully sealed. Inside were four neat piles of women's clothing, each with shoes, personal effects, and a small purse containing identification for Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore. The dry conditions preserved everything perfectly. Brother Morrison alerted Bishop Harold Stevenson, who contacted church headquarters. Elder James Tanner, a senior church leader with access to confidential records, arrived quickly. He examined the items and confirmed what older leaders had feared. Among the contents were final letters from the four women, written just before their deaths. Each one spoke of accepting their fate, convinced their sacrifice would lead to eternal glory. Sarah's letter, written in her careful handwriting, thanked God for the honor of being chosen, providence to take part in the sealing ordinance that would bind their family together for eternity. Rebecca's letter was longer and more doctrinal, referencing obscure teachings and her belief that the shedding of innocent blood in righteousness could open the path to celestial glory for all involved if done in full submission to God's will. Mary's letter was the most heartbreaking, filled with tender references to her unborn child and her faith that offering 2 lives would count double in the Lord's eyes. Ruth's letter was the shortest, mostly expressions of love for her family and her excitement about joining the eternal family in what she believed was the most sacred way. Together, the letters made it clear the women hadn't been forced into their deaths. They believed they were participating in a sacred ritual. This was, in some ways, even harder to accept than murder. Ezekiel hadn't just killed his wives, he'd convinced them that it was what God wanted. Elder Tanner immediately halted construction and contacted the church's historical department, asking them to locate the sealed records tied to the original Whitmore case. What they uncovered added depth to the tragedy, but also brought forward even more unsettling questions. The sealed records contained Bishop Curtis's complete investigation notes, including parts that had never been shared with other church officials. One of the most troubling discoveries was evidence that the Whitmore case might not have been isolated. Ezekiel's journals had mentioned letters from other Mormon men who claimed to receive similar revelations, visions that told them family sacrifice was a divine requirement. One particular letter, intercepted by Bishop Curtis in 1849, was addressed to Ezekiel at a remote Nevada mining camp. It was signed only with the initials J.M. and used coded language referencing the completion of the work and satisfaction that the sealing had been accomplished according to the pattern revealed to us. It also said others who had received the same calling had fulfilled their obligations with equal commitment. This suggested that Ezekiel hadn't been alone. He had likely been part of a secret group within the early Mormon community, one that had taken extreme interpretations of church teachings and turned them into justification for ritual killings. Their belief that true, full devotion required the ultimate sacrifice, offering the lives of their family members in exchange for exaltation in the next life. Elder Tanner's team began reviewing old church records, looking for similar cases, disappearances, sudden family relocations, or deaths that might align with this pattern. What they found was disturbing. From 1847 to 1855, at least a dozen families had reported missing members under suspicious circumstances. In most cases, the official story was that they'd moved east or gone on spiritual missions. Often, it was a husband or father who reported it, citing divine revelation as the reason. Individually, these incidents hadn't raised alarms, but together they pointed to something more coordinated. The victims were usually women and children. The men involved were often respected leaders known for deep religious commitment. Letters between some of them showed they had been in contact, reinforcing each other's beliefs and developing theological frameworks to justify their actions. Their doctrines were drawn from obscure church writings and twisted interpretations of Scripture. To them, plural marriage wasn't the end of spiritual obedience, it was the beginning. The highest form of faith, they believed, required sacrificing loved ones for God. As the investigation continued, the full extent of the group's reach became more apparent. They had connections across the Utah Territory and even among church leadership. Eventually, church authorities did take action. By the mid-1850s, many suspected members had been quietly removed from leadership or forced to leave. These purges were never made public. There were no official records, no announcements. The goal was to protect the church's reputation at a time when scrutiny from outsiders was already intense. But the discovery at Mill Creek suggested the group's actions had gone far beyond what had been suspected. The way the women's belongings had been carefully preserved made it clear. These were not the careless acts of unstable men. They were part of a structured, intentional belief system, one that saw the killings as sacred rituals that had to be documented and remembered. One question now haunted Elder Tanner and his team. Had the group really been shut down in the 1850s? Or had some members escaped and continued their activities in more remote areas? The evidence pointed to something far larger and more organized than anyone had imagined. And the most chilling part, what was found next. As the excavation at the Mill Creek site expanded, it became clear that the initial chamber was only part of a larger structure. Underneath it was a second, larger space carved into the bedrock about 12 feet square and 6 feet deep. Its design was deliberate and sophisticated, complete with drainage systems that had kept it dry for over 70 years. The stone walls were engraved with religious symbols, blending Mormon temple imagery with Masonic signs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and depictions of sacrificial rituals. At the center of the chamber was a granite altar, stained with what tests later confirmed to be human blood. Surrounding it were four smaller stone platforms. Each bore the name of one of the four Whitmore women: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, along with dates from the winter of 1847 to 48. The inscriptions included scripture passages, altered in ways that justified the taking of human life for spiritual gain. Above the central altar, one inscription read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and greater still is the love that lays down the lives of the beloved for the glory of God." When the team excavated beneath the platforms, they made their most horrifying discovery. Each held a burial space, and inside were human remains carefully preserved using mummification techniques. The bodies had been prepared with materials and methods suggesting real knowledge of ancient preservation, possibly inspired by early Mormon interest in Egyptian culture. The condition of the remains made it possible to determine how the women had died. Each had suffered a single, precise stab wound to the heart, made with what appeared to be a ceremonial blade. The wounds were identical, same depth, same location, indicating a practiced ritual. The women were dressed in special white robes, adorned with symbols and personal items believed to hold spiritual meaning. These garments had clearly been made specifically for the ceremony, with great care and attention to detail. This discovery forced investigators to consider something even more unsettling. Not only had the women consented to their deaths, but they had likely taken part in a ritual they truly believed was sacred. The evidence suggested each death had been part of a sequence, carried out over several weeks. As part of a larger spiritual process, carved into the chamber's walls were detailed stone tablets, recording every step of the ceremonies. They included the women's last words and declarations of faith, along with references to the great work and the revealed pattern guiding the group's actions. It was no longer a question of whether this was real, it clearly was, and the site had been built to last. Everything about its design, the drainage, the preservation, the storage areas indicated that it had been made for repeated use. There were spaces for preparing more victims and storage for ceremonial tools and garments. Investigators even found records that confirmed additional victims had been buried there. Between 1848 and 1855, according to carvings, at least 8 other people from 3 different families had been sealed in the chamber during that time. Many of these families had previously been reported missing from early Mormon settlements. The conclusion was unavoidable. The secret group had operated for nearly a decade, conducting a series of ritual killings they believed were commanded by God and essential for spiritual exaltation. The scope of what had happened beneath Mill Creek was staggering, and the most troubling part, the investigation wasn't over. What lay ahead would challenge everything the church believed it knew about its early history, and the people who helped shape it. ChatGPT said, the group's actions weren't random or disorganized. They had created permanent facilities to carry out their ceremonies and had written extensive justifications for what they were doing. Elder Tanner and his team had uncovered what might be the darkest and most damaging chapter in Mormon history, a secret network within the early church that had carried out ritual killings over a period of years. The implications for both the church's legacy and the faith of its members were overwhelming. Among the evidence were detailed records, lists of future targets, outlines for expanding operations, and even coordinated plans across several Mormon settlements in Utah. Some members of this group had held leadership positions within the church itself, using their access to internal records to identify vulnerable families and cover up the group's activities. These men had taken advantage of religious trust and spiritual authority, convincing others that these sacrifices were required for salvation. Tanner and his team realized they were dealing with more than just isolated incidents. This was an organized conspiracy that had reached the upper levels of early church leadership. Faced with such a grave discovery, Elder Tanner contacted the church's first presidency to report his findings and ask for direction. What happened next would determine whether the truth would ever be known, or if it would be buried to protect the church from backlash and scrutiny. As the excavation continued, Tanner's team uncovered something even more disturbing: a hidden passage behind a false wall leading deeper underground. This secret corridor brought them to a second chamber, smaller but far more carefully built than the one above. Stonework lined the walls, adorned with intricate religious symbols. The ceiling was supported by expertly cut archways, proof of skilled planning and craftsmanship. This chamber appeared to be the group's inner sanctum, the place where their highest-level meetings and ceremonies took place. In the center stood a stone table covered in carved maps of Mormon settlements throughout Utah. Marked on these maps were specific homes, families, and locations designated for ritual activities. The information was shockingly detailed, noting which families were most susceptible, especially those in remote areas or in complex polygamous households where disappearances might go unnoticed. But it was the stone tablets discovered in this chamber that exposed the full belief system behind the group. They revealed that the leader was a man named Jeremiah Blackwood. He claimed he had received divine revelations from Joseph Smith himself, instructing him to form what he called the Order of Eternal Sacrifice. According to Blackwood, these teachings were passed down during private conversations in Nauvoo, where he developed an extreme interpretation of doctrines related to celestial marriage and eternal families. Blackwood believed that true devotion to God meant being willing to give everything, including the lives of one's own family, in order to gain eternal exaltation. The tablets laid out the process for selecting families to participate in the order's rituals. Deep faith, isolation from the community, and lack of close ties that might raise questions. Polygamous families were ideal because their structure often made it easier to explain absences or departures. Ezekiel Whitmore was recruited during the winter of 1846 to 47. Just before the Mormon migration to Utah, Blackwood saw Ezekiel as the perfect candidate, deeply devout, emotionally reserved, and married to four women with few connections in the broader church. The recruitment process was slow and deliberate, beginning with discussions about higher laws and gradually moving to increasingly radical ideas. By the time the Whitmore family reached Utah, Ezekiel was fully committed. The tablets also revealed that Blackwood had set up similar groups in multiple Mormon settlements. Each group operated independently under local leaders, but they stayed in contact through coded letters and secret gatherings. Ritual sites like the one found at Mill Creek were constructed to preserve records and artifacts for what they believed would be a future day when the church would recognize these acts as holy ordinances. Among the documents was a detailed account of the final days of the Whitmore family. The first ceremony began on December 20, 1847, with Sarah volunteering to participate in what she believed was a sacred act that would ensure her family's eternal reward. The other wives followed over the next several weeks, with Ruth's ceremony taking place on February 15, 1848. The tablets describe how each woman spent her final days in prayer, preparation, and spiritual readiness. They wrote farewell letters, prepared burial garments, and participated in what they believed were sacred temple rites. Even more unsettling, the tablets included transcripts of their conversations. The women weren't only compliant, they were encouraging each other, reinforcing their shared belief that this was God's will. Their final words reflected excitement and gratitude for being chosen. The order had also planned for further expansion. Their records included names of more families they intended to recruit, and outlined plans to build more chambers in the Western Territories. Blackwood believed their practices would eventually be accepted as official doctrine, but by the mid-1850s, church leaders began to see a pattern in the disappearances. A secret investigation, led by Brigham Young himself, identified members of the order and quickly moved to shut them down. Some members were quietly excommunicated or sent to remote locations under supervision. Ritual chambers were destroyed or sealed. All records were locked away to prevent public scandal. Blackwood disappeared during the crackdown. Reports suggested he fled to California, where he may have continued spreading his beliefs. While nothing was confirmed, hints in later documents suggested that he had established small groups in mining camps and frontier towns. One of the most disturbing discoveries was Blackwood's final message. Written before his disappearance, he predicted that one day the church would embrace the order's teachings and that the sacrifices made would be honored. He told his followers to protect their records and continue their work in secrecy until the time was right. Tanner's team had uncovered proof of a major historical crisis, one that reached into the highest ranks of early Mormon leadership and led to the deaths of dozens, possibly hundreds, of people. The evidence raised serious questions. What did church leaders know, and when? Did anyone try to stop the order before it was too late? The most troubling possibility was that some members of the order had escaped detection and continued their work. Signs pointed to ritual chambers in other states and hinted at a broader influence on early Mormon beliefs than had ever been acknowledged. Faced with this overwhelming truth, Elder Tanner prepared his final report. He knew that releasing this information could devastate the faith of millions and forever alter the public image of the church, but burying it would mean letting the victims remain forgotten. The final decision came in a private meeting of the First Presidency on November 15, 1920. Present were President Heber J. Grant, his counselors, and the most senior apostles. Elder Tanner presented his findings during a 3-hour session described by one participant as the most sobering meeting in church history. After discussion, President Grant made the decision the evidence would be preserved but not made public. It would be stored in the church's most secure archives, accessible only to top leadership. Quiet memorials would be held for the victims, but their stories would remain confidential. The risk to public faith and the potential for anti-Mormon backlash were deemed too great. The Mill Creek site was quietly abandoned. The underground chambers were filled with concrete, and construction resumed at a new location 3 miles away. The new meeting house opened 6 months later without any public knowledge of what had been found. But the investigation wasn't over. Some of the tablets referenced Western brothers who had taken the order's beliefs to new communities in California, Nevada, and Colorado. A secondary investigation, this time led by church security rather than missionaries, quietly identified 3 more ritual sites. One of the most chilling was in Virginia City, Nevada, where a chamber appeared to have been in use as recently as 1875. These discoveries prompted the church to launch a secret effort to track and dismantle remaining order cells. Agents worked discreetly, using church resources to find individuals involved and either shut down their activity or move them to places where they couldn't continue. This program continued for nearly 20 years, identifying 6 more order groups. The last active cell was uncovered in 1895. Jeremiah Blackwood, now an old man living under an alias, had built a small following in a Colorado mining camp. Investigators confirmed he and his followers had carried out at least 12 more ritual killings. In the previous decade, Blackwood's capture and the seizure of his records finally ended the Order's operations. These records revealed connections to other fringe religious movements and influence on early church teachings that extended farther than anyone had realized. Still, the church never acknowledged this campaign publicly. The victims' names were added to internal memorials, their deaths quietly honored, but the details remained sealed. Elder Tanner never spoke of what he'd seen. He lived to age 93, and in his personal writings left only a brief mention, the most difficult investigation of my life, and a prayer that the victims would find peace in the eternity they sought. Through such painful means, the stone chambers beneath Mill Creek remain sealed. The truth about Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives, and the hundreds of others lost to the order of eternal sacrifice, is held in the church's most protected archives, known only to a few. To this day, leaders occasionally revisit the question of whether the truth should be made public. So far, every generation has decided against it. The victims are still officially recorded as pioneers who vanished on their journey west. The Mill Creek area is now home to families, schools, and places of worship. Most residents have no idea that beneath their feet lies one of the most carefully buried secrets in Mormon history. Whether that secret will ever be revealed is a question for future church leaders. But the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his wives is a powerful reminder of how faith, when taken to dangerous extremes, can lead to devastating consequences, and of how the desire for eternal glory can sometimes come at a terrible price. If you found this story chilling, consider what other truths might still be hidden in America's religious past. Hit like if you believe some secrets are too dark to stay buried, and subscribe to join our search for history's most unsettling mysteries. Should the church reveal the full truth, or is some knowledge best left in silence? Let me know in the comments, and share this video with someone who isn't afraid to face uncomfortable truths.